Before we dive into this spine-chilling story, please subscribe now for daily tales you won't want to miss. My name's Leo, and I'm a painter. I've been doing this for years, picking up odd jobs here and there to make ends meet. Sometimes it's a quick gig like touching up a few walls, and other times it's something bigger. This job, though, was different. I got a call late one night from someone I didn't know. He didn't give me his full name, just said he was the new owner of a house in Savannah. The place had been abandoned for years after the last guy vanished without a trace. He offered me a ridiculous sum of money if I could paint the place for him. I'm not one to pass up on a good deal, so I agreed. I drove out there the next day. The house was old, really old, standing alone at the end of a long, winding road. You could tell it hadn't seen much love in years. The windows were boarded up, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. But the place had character. There was something about it that made me feel like I was stepping into history. At least, that's what I told myself. When I met the owner, he wasn't what I expected. He was a young guy, maybe in his 30s, but he had this strange vibe about him. Like he was too eager for me to start the job. He gave me the keys, told me to make myself at home, and left. No small talk. Just handed me the tools and disappeared. I started setting up in the living room. The air was thick with dust. There were old portraits on the walls, some of them crooked, like they hadn't been touched in ages. As I was getting my things ready, I noticed one of the portraits. It was of a man, serious looking, with a stern expression. The frame was off-center, so I straightened it. When I did, the back of the frame came loose, and something fell to the ground. It was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. I picked it up, wondering who'd left it there and what it meant. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic, like someone had written it in a hurry. I started reading it. There were a few lines, all rules. I couldn't make sense of it at first, but the oddness of it caught my attention. The first rule was simple enough. Do not leave the hallway light off after midnight. I figured it was just some weird superstition or something the old owner had written out of habit. But I left the note there on the floor, not thinking much of it. I set to work, painting the walls, my mind still on the note. The house felt empty, quiet, too quiet. It was like something was watching me, but I shook it off. I was used to working alone in old places. The silence didn't bother me. Not yet. As I worked through the evening, things started to get strange. At first, it was just little things. The air in the house felt heavier than it should. The shadows in the corners of the rooms seemed to stretch longer than they should have. But I told myself it was just my imagination. I'd been in houses like this before, where the history and the silence play tricks on your mind. Around midnight, I took a break in the hallway. The house was old, and the floorboards creaked under my feet. I leaned against the wall, staring at the dim light fixture hanging overhead. There was an odd flicker, like the light was struggling to stay on. For a second, I thought I saw something in the reflection of the light, a shadow moving across the hall. But when I turned, there was nothing there. I chalked it up to exhaustion. It had been a long day, and I was starting to feel the weight of the hours I'd spent working. But as I stood there, I heard something. A faint whisper. It came from the wall, just off to my left. I froze. I listened carefully. There it was again, a soft, almost inaudible murmur. At first, I figured it was just the house settling, the wind outside, maybe. But there was no wind that night. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. I couldn't make out the words, but it felt like it was calling to me. I wanted to ignore it, to brush it off, but something about the sound made my skin crawl. I took a few steps back, and that's when I noticed it. The paint on the western wall, the one I had just finished covering, was peeling off. It wasn't like the usual dry paint cracking. No, this was different. The paint was coming off in strips, almost like the wall was rejecting it. I stepped back, eyes wide, wondering what the hell was going on. But then I remembered something from the note, the rule I had read earlier. Never enter the western room after dark. I hadn't yet crossed that line, but I was close. I could feel it. The whispers grew louder, almost angry now. I couldn't understand it, but I knew I needed to stay away from that room. I took a deep breath, telling myself it was just nerves, just the stress of being alone in a strange house. But the unease kept growing. I left the hallway and went back to the living room, hoping to shake off the feeling. But every time I glanced over at the western wall, the whispers seemed to follow me. The night dragged on, each minute feeling longer than the last. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive in some way, that it was watching me, waiting. My nerves were on edge, and the more I tried to focus on the task at hand, the more I felt like I was being pulled into something deeper. I couldn't ignore the whispers anymore. They weren't just in my head. They were coming from the walls, the floors, the air itself. It was as if the house was trying to speak to me, or maybe it was trying to warn me. I didn't know which, but I knew one thing for sure. I didn't like it. I decided to take a break. My hands were shaking from the constant tension, and I figured I could use a moment to clear my head. I stepped into the hallway again, hoping the silence would calm me down. But instead, the light above flickered again, and this time, it stayed off for a few seconds longer than normal. I cursed under my breath and hit the switch. Nothing. The hallway light had gone out completely. That's when it hit me. There was a reason for the rule. Do not leave the hallway light off after midnight. It was right there, written on the paper I'd found earlier. I wasn't sure if it was some kind of superstition or if it meant something more, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. The last thing I needed was for this house to get any more upset with me than it already was. So, I turned the switch back on, the faint light flickering to life again, casting long shadows along the hallway. But as the light came back on, I saw something in the reflection of the light fixture. A dark shape. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't tell what it was, but it moved. Slowly. Purposefully. I turned, but when I looked down the hallway, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just the shadows, that it was nothing more than my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was here. Something was in this house with me. The whispers started up again, louder now, filling my ears. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out of that hallway. But as I turned to head back to the living room, I noticed something even stranger. The walls seemed to be closing in on me. The hallway stretched further than it should have, like it was never ending. I looked back over my shoulder, but the hallway was still the same. Yet somehow it felt like I had walked miles in just a few seconds. I rushed into the living room, my mind reeling. I had to finish this job. I had to get it done, get out of here, and never look back. But deep down, I knew that whatever was in this house wasn't going to let me leave so easily. I tried to shake it off. I really did. I thought about the money, the job. I told myself I could finish the painting, pack up, and leave. No harm, no foul. But with every hour that passed, the house felt more oppressive. The air was thick, and the strange buzzing in the back of my mind grew louder. By the time the clock struck midnight, I was well into the second coat of paint on the living room walls. I was trying to focus, to ignore the strange noises, the whispers, the way the house seemed to shift around me. I heard the clock ticking in the corner, each second echoing off the walls. My hands were trembling as I dipped the brush back into the can, but I couldn't stop. That's when I heard it. The chimes. The clock in the living room began to toll, loud and slow, like it was ringing out the time in some ancient ritual. My heart skipped a beat. The sound was almost eerie, like it didn't belong in this house at all. I froze, brush in hand. I remembered the rule. If the old clock in the living room chimes, stop what you're doing and sit still until it stops. I didn't want to stop. I didn't want to follow the rules, but I knew better. The house was already giving me trouble, and I wasn't about to push my luck. I set the brush down and stood there, motionless, waiting for the chimes to stop. Each chime seemed to stretch longer and longer, filling the room with an oppressive weight. It felt like the house was breathing, like it was waiting for me to make a move. I couldn't help but glance around, half expecting something to be standing in the doorway, watching me. But there was nothing, just the sound of the clock, ticking down the seconds. When the chimes finally stopped, I breathed a sigh of relief. The house was still. The air felt slightly lighter, but I didn't feel safe. The walls seemed to hum with tension, like they were holding their breath until I made my next move. I picked up the brush again, my hands still shaking. I couldn't let myself think about it too much. I had a job to do, and I was going to finish it. But as I started painting once more, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. The whispers were louder now, more urgent, like they were trying to tell me something. I tried to push it out of my mind, focusing on the task at hand. But the house wasn't done with me yet. I tried to focus on the painting, but the more I did, the more I realized how little control I had over the situation. It was like the house was pushing back against me, refusing to let me finish. Every brushstroke I made seemed to vanish almost as quickly as I applied it. The paint peeled off the walls, curling up like it was alive, like it was rejecting my touch. It was frustrating. More than that, it was terrifying. I could feel my nerves fraying, my patience wearing thin. Every time I tried to push forward, the house seemed to fight me every step of the way. I stood back to get a better look at the wall, wiping sweat from my brow, but the whispers were getting louder again. I turned my head, expecting to see something in the corner of my eye, anything, but there was nothing. The air in the room felt colder, thicker, almost as if it was pressing down on me. And still, the whispering continued, coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, that it was nothing more than the old wood creaking. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. There was something in this house with me. Something that didn't want me here. I told myself to focus. I had to finish this. But as I reached for the brush again, I heard it. A voice, low, guttural. Just behind me. It was unmistakable. The whispers had formed words. Leave, it hissed. I spun around, my heart racing in my chest, but there was nothing. The room was empty. Silent. I felt a chill run through me, my breath coming out in shallow gasps. The whispers died down, but the tension in the room remained. I felt like I was being suffocated by it. The walls were closing in, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could stand it. A cold shiver ran down my spine as the rule came to mind. Ignore any whispers you hear. They are not real. I wasn't sure if the voice I heard was part of the house or part of my mind, but I knew I had to follow the rule. I had to ignore it. I had to finish the job. I couldn't let the house get inside my head, but it was getting harder and harder to stay focused. The shadows seemed to shift on their own, the light in the room dimming as though the house was drawing in the light itself. I forced myself to take another step toward the wall, but the whispering returned, louder this time. It was almost like a chant now all around me. The walls were vibrating, humming with the sound. The floor beneath me felt unstable, as if it might give way at any moment. But I had to finish. I had to get out of here. By now, I felt like I was on the edge of losing my sanity. Every time I tried to concentrate, the house seemed to fight back. The whispers, the shadows, the eerie chimes of the old clock. It was all becoming too much. I was trapped in this endless cycle of tension, unable to break free. But I kept going. I kept working. I had to finish the job. I wasn't going to let this house win. At some point, I stopped checking the time. It didn't matter anymore. The house felt like it existed outside of time. The minutes dragged on forever, and yet, every time I looked at the clock, it seemed to be moving too fast, like the night was slipping away from me. I stepped back and looked at the walls again. The paint was peeling faster now, almost as if the house was deliberately undoing my work. My stomach churned. I couldn't take this much longer. And then, just as I was about to turn back to the window, I heard it. The chimes again. This time louder. The old clock in the living room started to toll, slow and steady. Each chime rang out with an authority that sent a shiver down my spine. I froze, brush in hand. I couldn't move. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The rule was my only hope. If the old clock in the living room chimes, stop what you're doing and sit still until it stops. I had no choice but to obey. I knew this wasn't a suggestion. This wasn't something I could ignore. The tension in the air built as the chimes echoed through the house, filling every corner with an unnatural stillness. I set the brush down and stood there, my legs stiff, my mind racing. The chimes seemed to go on forever, each toll growing louder and louder. The house felt like it was shaking, like it was alive. The walls creaked and groaned, and I heard something moving behind me. I couldn't turn around. I couldn't even look. I had to stay still. I had to wait for the chimes to stop. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the chimes ceased. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I was shaking, my hands trembling as I picked up the brush again. But even though the clock had stopped chiming, I felt like I couldn't breathe. The house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for me to make a mistake. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep going. But somehow I had to finish. I had to get out of here. As I stood there, frozen in the wake of the chimes, the air in the room felt heavier, thicker. I wanted to move, to do something, anything, but I couldn't. Every instinct told me to stay still, to follow the rules, even though every part of me was screaming to get out. I finally managed to take a step, feeling my legs unsteady beneath me, like they hadn't moved in hours. The house seemed to shift under my feet, the floorboards creaking as though they too were warning me to tread carefully. I reached for the brush again, the handle cold in my grip. I glanced at the window for a moment, and a thought crossed my mind. The room felt suffocating now. The air was thick with the smell of paint and dust, and I could feel a strange heat creeping through the walls, like the house itself was alive, breathing in the darkness. I stood there, contemplating whether I should open the window. The heat inside the room was unbearable, and the oppressive atmosphere was suffocating. I could feel the sweat running down my neck and back, soaking my shirt. But then I remembered the rule. Do not open any windows, no matter how hot it gets. I froze, my hand lingering just inches from the window. The room felt even hotter now, as if the house was punishing me for even considering breaking the rule. I could hear the faint sound of whispers again, this time coming from the western wall, but I ignored them. I had learned my lesson by now. I stepped away from the window, my chest tight with anxiety. I didn't know what was worse, the heat or the fear that something was waiting for me just beyond the door. The whispers grew louder, as if they were beckoning me, urging me to go into the western room. I couldn't fight the feeling that something was wrong, that something was waiting for me there. The thought of leaving the room to check it out was terrifying, but it was like the house had some kind of pull on me. It wanted me to break the rules. It wanted me to make a mistake. I turned back to my work, forcing myself to focus. I couldn't let the house control me. But as I picked up the brush again, the shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, stretching out toward me, like they were reaching for me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the room anymore. That something else was there, something that had been waiting all along. I could hear the faint scraping sound now, like something or someone was moving just out of sight. The more I focused on the noise, the more it sounded like footsteps. I knew I had to get out of here. But the longer I stayed, the more I realized I was trapped. At some point, I lost track of time entirely. My mind was a fog, and the house seemed to stretch on forever, like the walls were closing in around me. Every time I looked at the clock, it seemed like more time had passed than I could account for. The seconds blurred together, and the silence became a living thing, pressing against my skull, making it harder to think, harder to breathe. The whispers were relentless now. They had gone from soft murmurs to full-on voices, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I tried to block them out, but they were everywhere, behind me, beside me, and deep within the walls. They were like a part of the house, crawling inside my head, urging me to do something. Anything. I tried to focus on the task at hand, telling myself that I just needed to finish the painting. It was the only way out. But every time I picked up the brush, it was like the house was rejecting me, pushing back against my every movement. Then, without warning, the light in the hallway flickered. The bulb buzzed, and for a brief moment, the entire hallway was plunged into darkness. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, staring into the blackness. I knew what that meant. I had broken the rule. Do not leave the hallway light off after midnight. The light flickered again, and I could hear the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway, just outside the door. I didn't dare move. I just stood there, frozen, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. I could feel the heat rising in the room, making it harder to breathe. The shadows crept closer, and I could hear the whispers growing louder. I knew deep down that I couldn't escape this. Not anymore. The house was alive, and it wasn't going to let me leave. The moment I broke the rule, something inside the house shifted, like the entire structure had come alive. I could feel it in my bones. The floorboards trembled beneath my feet, the air around me thickened, and the house seemed to groan in response to my mistake. It was like the walls were closing in, and I was being trapped in a cage I couldn't escape. I stood frozen, trying to make sense of what was happening, but my mind was a whirlwind of panic and fear. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like they were urging me to go further, to give in to whatever the house wanted. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the pressure building all around me. Suddenly, the ground beneath me buckled, as if the house itself was shifting. The hallway stretched out in front of me, but it felt wrong. The walls bent, the space distorting, and the path seemed to unravel in a way I couldn't comprehend. I turned back to the living room, but nothing looked the same. The shadows were longer now, stretching across the room like dark fingers reaching for me. The old portrait of the stern man on the wall seemed to loom over me, watching with eyes that weren't just painted, but alive, waiting for me to make my move. I started to run, my feet moving faster than I ever thought they could, but the hallway stretched out before me, an endless, twisting corridor that went on forever. It was like the house was playing with me, letting me think I could escape, but never allowing me to reach the end. I could feel the walls closing in, the floor shifting beneath me as I stumbled forward. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I reached out for something, anything, to hold on to. But there was nothing, and then I saw it. The paper. It was lying on the floor ahead of me, just beyond my reach. I don't know how it got there, but I instinctively knew it was the key. I lunged for it, my fingers brushing against the edges as I picked it up. My heart raced as I flipped it over, my breath catching in my throat. The back of the paper was scrawled with a message. If you've broken only one rule, take the basement door and run. More than one. There is no escape. I stared at the words, my mind reeling. It was like I was being given one last chance. I didn't know what would happen if I didn't follow the instructions, but I knew I had to try. There was no time left to think. I turned, my eyes scanning the hallway for the basement door. When I saw it, glowing faintly in the distance, I didn't hesitate. I ran toward it, my legs aching, my chest tight with fear, but I kept going. The whispers were deafening now, clawing at my mind, urging me to stop, to turn back. But I couldn't. I had to escape. I threw the door open with all my strength, the cold air from the basement hitting me like a wave. I rushed down the stairs without looking back, my heart pounding in my ears. I could feel the walls of the house shifting again, the ground shaking beneath me, as if something was chasing me. I didn't dare stop to look. At the bottom of the stairs, I found what I was hoping for, a tunnel. It was barely wide enough for me to crawl through, the walls damp and cold, but it was my only way out. I didn't think about what I was leaving behind. I just scrambled through, my hands scraping against the rough stone as I moved as fast as I could. The growls and whispers were growing louder, the sounds of something pursuing me, but I didn't dare turn back. I just kept crawling, the tunnel seeming to stretch on forever, until finally, I saw the light. I broke free, tumbling out into the woods behind the house, gasping for air. I looked back, and there it was, the house. But it wasn't the same anymore. The windows glowed with an unnatural light, and the porch seemed to be filled with dark shapes. The shadows stood there, watching me, their glowing eyes fixed on me as I stumbled backward, away from the house. I could feel the weight of their gaze on me, the house calling me back, but I knew I couldn't go back. Not ever again. The next morning, I found myself waiting outside, already packed and ready to leave. My hands were shaking, and my clothes were drenched in sweat. I couldn't even look at that house anymore. The thought of going back inside made my stomach twist. I had to get as far from it as possible. When the new owner finally arrived, I didn't speak. I just handed him the crumpled note, the one that had saved my life. I couldn't look at his face. I could see the curiosity in his eyes as he unfolded the paper, but I didn't want to see his reaction. I didn't want to hear him question me or dismiss what I'd gone through. His eyes widened when he read the words, and I could see the confusion turning into concern. But I didn't wait for him to speak. I couldn't. I just turned and walked away. You don't want this place, I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper. Whatever is in there, it's not going to let you stay. I didn't need to hear anything else. I didn't need to see his face as he processed what I'd said. I couldn't bear it. I kept walking, not looking back. The weight of the house's gaze was still there, pressing against my back, but I ignored it. I had made it out, and I wasn't going to be pulled back in. As I reached my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The shadows in the windows, the whispers in my mind, they were still there, lurking beneath the surface. I had escaped, but a part of me knew I would never truly be free from that house. The engine roared to life, and I drove away, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. The sound of the tires on the pavement was a small comfort, but the whispers, they still followed me. I never spoke to anyone about what had happened. Who would believe me? Who would understand? It was easier to keep it to myself, to let the memories fade into the background of my life. But deep down, I knew I'd never forget. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when the world is quiet and I'm alone, I can still hear it. The whispers, the scratching at the edges of my mind. I know the house is still out there, waiting, watching. And no matter how far I run, it will always be there, lurking in the dark, waiting for the next person to make a mistake. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for daily horror stories that get creepier every night.